a senior history major. My history advisor is Dr. Albert Dean, and I'm going to be talking to you about my thesis, which is titled Playing the Tar and Ball, the Carolingian Discourse on Kingship and Tyranny. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background information before I give you my thesis, because there are a lot of different names of people that I will be discussing. So the Carolingian dynasty was a Frankish royal dynasty that reigned from 751 CE to 988 CE, or 888 CE. The historical context for my thesis is the political upheaval that abounded during the reign of Louis the Pious and his descendants. So the first person that I discuss in my thesis is Louis the Pious, which you see like right up there. And he was the emperor of the Frankish Empire, and the Frankish Empire encompassed modern-day France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Italy. He was also the son of Charlemagne, who some of you might be familiar with. In my thesis, I mostly talk about his sons, Louis the German, his other son, Charles the Bald, and his grandson, Pippin II of Aquitaine. So something to note is that during Louis's reign, Aquitanian nobility installed Pippin II as king without his consent, which I'm going to get into a little bit more later. After Louis the Pious died, there was a civil war among his sons that ended after the Treaty of Verdun in 843. The empire was divided up accordingly. Louis the German got the eastern half of the Frankish Empire, which is like Bavaria and Germany. Charles the Bald got the western part, which encompasses modern-day France, and his other son, Lothar, got the middle part, which was called Lotharingia. However, Charles the Bald claimed a certain part of western Francia called Aquitaine, which, as I already mentioned, Pippin II ruled over. And so there was a lot of conflict there between the two, which I get into a lot with my thesis. Okay. So during these periods of political turmoil, there were numerous authors who reflected on notions of good kingship, legitimacy, illegitimacy, within their annals, treatises, and biographies. Rhetoric played an important role in these texts, as it was used as a tool to legitimate power. One such rhetorical device was accusations of tyranny, which are found in many 9th century texts. Carolingian notions of tyranny are the subject of this study. So the structure of my thesis is that I attempt to answer the question, what was Carolingian tyranny and the discourse surrounding it, and how tyranny was used as a rhetorical tool. I found that there was a conception of tyranny that consisted of specific actions and ideas that authors had in mind when they accused their political enemies of tyranny. Regarding my approach, I looked at where the terms tyranny and tyrant came up in the text that I was focusing on, and then looked at phrases, adjectives, and actions that were in proximity to that accusation. From these adjectives, phrases, and actions, I could then determine how the authors described tyranny and what their thoughts were about it. In my sources, I found a pattern of actions such as oath breaking, pillaging, rebelling, and adjectives like prideful, cowardly, and illegitimate that they associated with tyranny. So in my first chapter, I discuss Carolingian kingship. So I planned on, in my third chapter, contrasting tyranny and kingship, so I thought it would be important for my first chapter to just lay out what Carolingian conceptions of kingship were. I used Hinsmar's on who was the bishops of Reims, on the person of the king, and on the governance of the palace, Fagin's Life of Louis, Life of Lewis, and the Astronomer's Life of Emperor Lewis to examine the roles of kingship and the king's ministry, to correct subjects and lead them towards salvation. I found that for Fagin, kings were the leaders of the church and the guardians of the cult of God. Furthermore, for Hinsmar, kings served God through lawmaking. Finally, for Nittard, which was another author that I looked at, his histories, Charlemagne was an ideal king that later kings should use to emulate his example. In addition to following Charlemagne's example, Nittard judges a king based on their adherence to the public good. Furthermore, these authors all had similarities in their conceptions of kingship, which indicates that during the 9th century, there was maybe some consensus of what the origins and roles of kingship were. So all of my authors had things that were different, but they also had a lot of things that were similar in regards to kingship. All of them thought that virtue, such as love and mercy, were important aspects of kingship. And Fagin, Hinsmar, and Nittard believed that king needed to be moral in order to correct their subjects and lead them into being better people, and which would help them to get into heaven. Furthermore, kingly authority derived from God is what they believed. In my second chapter, I wanted to describe what some of these authors thought about tyranny in order to later discuss the rhetoric of tyranny. Therefore, my second chapter was about how authors described tyranny in the text and what concepts they associated with the discourse of tyranny. I found that the author who is not known, of the Annals of Fulda, which is one of the sources that I used, associates tyranny with illegitimacy, unlawful invasion, greed, fear, and oath-breaking, rebellion, and foreign alliances. In Hinsmar's De Divortio, which was a treatise on his thoughts on the divorce of Lothar II, who's right there, and his wife, he links tyranny with a lack of virtue and an unhealthy acquisition of power. And he also believed that God permitted tyrants to exist in order to punish the subjects for their sin. To also discuss Nittard's accusation of tyranny against Pippin II, who was right there, in order to see what he thought about it. He believes that tyranny was a regime set up without the consent of the emperor. However, in his histories, the big villain of his story is Lothar I, right up there. And he is Lothar I, and Lothar breaks oaths, he pillages, he destroys churches, he consorts with pagans, and he does all these things that I found were usually concepts and actions that were associated with tyranny in other texts. And so I wondered, why does Nittard never accuse Lothar of tyranny when he had every right to do so? Instead, he accuses Pippin II of tyranny because Pippin was set up by some Aquitanian nobles as king, and it was called an unlawful because he didn't do it with the consent of the